the book really comes out of a question that sits behind the question, do you condemn? Right? So do you condemn is the question that's being asked of many Muslims around the world, and particularly in Western societies. Do you condemn terrorism? Do you condemn this group, that group, or this person or that person? And the question that I think we really want to ask in this collection is, well, why is this question so important to you? What is it about me? What is it about us that makes this question so important in your life? Because when we ask that question, we come to really what we believe is the crux of the matter, which is a lack of trust that exists between various communities. In order for us to be brought in to humanity, in order for us to be considered to be worthy of being involved in the kind of the brotherhood of people, or kind of this social contract that we have with one another, we have to jump a certain hurdle in order to then be accepted. And that is really what we believe in this collection that question really does. It provides that hurdle, and you have to jump that hurdle to then become accepted. So you have to move from being a questionable Muslim into a good Muslim by answering that question explicitly when it's I would say asked, but really it's demanded, because it's always a demand. There is an element of coercion at play here, because without answering it, you are effectively holding yourself out as somebody that's unknowable, and potentially as somebody that's dangerous. So that's really crucial. And, I hope that sets the tone for the rest of the discussion, because of course, what we're going to be talking about really is racism, and a wider conception of racism within the confines of the global war on terror, and the way that it constructs Muslims as an other. Now, of course, Muslims aren't a particular race. So what we're talking about here are processes of racialization, where superficial markers are used in order to effectively make an assessment about the potential dangerousness that is tied to our beliefs, our bodies, the clothing that we wear, the length of our facial hair, etc., etc. That these all become markers of potential danger, or things to be feared. And so, what ultimately, this all leads to is the idea that the question carries consequences. It carries consequences in our lives. This is not a value neutral question when it's asked. When you answer it, you leave something of yourself behind, because you realize that actually this person who potentially you thought you knew, you didn't know them as well as you might have. That they had an instinct which was to ask something of you, which changes your relationship then. And I think that the consequences of that question is probably one of the least studied aspects of this. And we don't really go into that in this book. We do talk about our personal experiences. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that's presented throughout. But I think it's really important that somebody at some point does a long-term study of what the consequence of this particular question is. How, what does it do to you as an individual? How does it make you feel in relation to the kind of relationships that you have, whether it's in school or in university or in the workplace, And I guess what the contributors to the collection do so well is that they make visible some of these consequences. They make them, really, really apparent. There's no hiding from it anymore, because they've opened up themselves in a way that I think they should be applauded for. And it's one of the things that we wanted for this book as well. Michael mentioned at the start that it's not strictly an academic text. And I was very forceful about that with the contributors, and some of the academics in particular. You know, poor things. They initially struggled with that a little bit when I said, no, I don't want you to prove a case. I want you to speak about what it means to live the response to that question, because we're not here to prove our case. I'm not here to try and convince people that this is a terrible question to ask. What I was hoping for was that we would make visible how this impacts us in various ways. And as you go through the book, you see that actually there are so many layers to the way that question is asked, but also the way that it's answered too. And so whether it's in academia or it's within the entertainment industry, there are permutations to that question and the way that that question ultimately you know, has an impact. For me, this was quite a personal endeavor too, because it's been a question that I've been asked many times. In most cases, I expected the question and responded accordingly, you know, often highlighting how I've always felt it was Islamophobic for that question to be asked. There's a particular exchange that I had with the Channel 4 presenter Matt Frey, where I really take him to task over you know, him asking whether or not I supported ISIS. But actually, the one time I was really, I guess, confounded was the moment that I speak about in the book and I concentrate on, which is when Jon Snow pretty much asked me the same thing. And I guess, as somebody who had admired Jon Snow for such a long time, you know, pretty much throughout the whole period of time that I've been ever watching the news, you know, somebody that I really considered to be, you know, somebody who's very, very fair and very balanced. It came as a shock to my system. You know, all the others, it was expected. It never really felt like, you know, a genuine question coming from them. It never really felt like a question that I didn't expect coming from any of the others. But with Jon Snow, it you know, this is somebody that it came out of the blue for me. And what was so interesting about that, and again, I write about this at the start of the book, is not only the psychological, but the physiological markers that left on me many years down the line. Like, to this day, I still feel a sense of dread and anxiety in certain spaces and certain times when a question like that is asked, or when the media are you know, kind of demanding similar things from us. And I guess that really made me think a lot about, you know, a lot of the people who don't necessarily have an understanding of the way that trauma works. I'm very fortunate. I've studied trauma. My daily work life as an ethnographer is to take trauma testimony from people who've been tortured all over the world. So I had a very good understanding of what happens to the body whenever I'm feeling that same difficulty. I'm able to go to my family, to my wife in particular, and say, hey, look, you know, I've just had this email come through, or just had this difficult experience. This is what's happening to my body. I might be quiet for a little while. You know, I understand what's going on as an intellectual exercise, you know, but my ability to control it isn't there necessarily, but at least I'm able to understand it. And so what's interesting with a lot of young people now, having read the book, people who are in university, is they've read those sections and they've emailed me and told me about how they feel a sense of dread whenever they go into a certain lecturer's room, whenever he asks them about why they're wearing hijab, whenever they are quizzed about their beliefs in Islam, that they said that we never understood why our bodies were having such a visceral reaction to just entering into the room, being in the same presence as you know, as somebody who's supposed to teach us. And so, you know, that's why I guess in many ways for me the book became more important than I had previously, you know, potentially understood, because I hadn't really thought of how others might be experiencing these things in the same way. And in fact, really, when I wrote the introduction, I wrote that about myself. I had I hadn't anticipated that I was going to do so. It was something that, really actually think a great deal about. It's the first time I've ever spoken about my trauma. But I think it helped me in some way. It was a small catharsis for me to do so. And now I can see how it might have helped others at least confront the fact that this is something that is problematic, that this is something that needs to be studied more closely, and it needs to be addressed really more than anything else. So I've spoken for a while now, and I know that we're going to be able to open this conversation up to a lot more as we discuss with you all. So yeah, I'll stop there for now if that's okay.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that story, which is really compellingly opens the book. I'm so glad that you're able to share that story with us here. I want to invite now Fahad Ansari, who has joined us and was also one of the contributors for this book. Fahad is a lawyer with Riverway Law. And Fahad, if your microphone is up, then I will turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for having me. We had a string of events in the wake of the launch of the book, and things had gone a bit quiet for a while, so it's good to be talking about the book again. I wanted to share an experience I had, my first experience with counterterrorism police and the authorities, to give you a taste of how that has shaped my life moving forward. It was when I was a master's student at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and I was studying for my LLM in international human rights law. Now, it was actually Good Friday in 2004. I was on my way to Friday prayers at the mosque with my cousin, and all of a sudden we were intercepted by two plainclothes officers who didn't identify themselves but proceeded to ask us a series of questions about our identities, where we were really from, because they didn't accept my first answer saying Ireland and providing them with my address, and questions about our political views. It came as a bit of a shock. It was just completely unexpected. If I look back on how I reacted then and how I would advise someone in that situation to react, I would have done everything differently. But it was that sudden harshness of the situation. In any event, contrary to my gut instinct, I ran after the guy to get his name and details. He literally stormed off. So I ran after him, and until he gave me his details, I harassed him, and I managed to get his details. I then put in a complaint about him to the Garda Síochána, the police force in Ireland, that he had acted racially, he had been discriminatory against me, etc., etc. When that was investigated, and I had police officers come to my house, and I was trying to get to understand, well, what was it that triggered this? I mean, I've lived my entire life without any problems with the police, with any issues, and this is Ireland. This is not the UK. And when it came to it, the officer investigating the complaint said to me, well, do you think it was appropriate for you to be dressed that way, outside the university? And I began thinking, what are you talking about? And it transpired then that a week earlier, the US ambassador had been visiting our university, and we had demonstrated, and part of the demonstration, I had donned an orange jumpsuit, and two of my colleagues in the university had worn military gear, and they were escorting me in front of the building where the ambassador was sitting and having his conference. And it was at that point I recognized the face of that special branch officer, because he was the one who was outside the building, and he'd obviously seen me. But the point being is, this officer investigating my complaint of harassment had the audacity to ask me whether it was appropriate for me to dress in a jumpsuit and make a political statement protesting against the treatment of detainees in Guantanamo Bay. There's other people in orange jumpsuits, none of who were actually visited by the special branch or accosted or encountered in any way. Yet me, the only brown Muslim, was. And he was justifying my harassment on the basis of me, particularly me, having a political opinion about something, a non-violent political opinion about something, no less. And I guess I never reflected deeply upon that until much later in my life. But it was a series of these events that kept happening again and again, particularly as I entered the legal sphere and I became a solicitor. And I began facing similar issues in my legal practice, whether it was within the firms I worked with colleagues, or within the court system, or in the way that, I guess the word that features quite prominently in the book is the ubiquity of the situation. It's everywhere. You can't even put your finger on it, but it's there. And when Asim approached me about the book and writing a chapter, I didn't quite know what to write initially, but as I started typing, it was so therapeutic. It was cathartic in that I got a lot of what had bothered me about being a Muslim lawyer dealing with national security cases. It allowed me to enumerate all these examples, which were at the back of my mind and clouding how I actually saw myself, my role, to the extent that I doubted at times. I would have conversations with my clients and I'd say, look, isn't it better that you instruct a white lawyer, a non-Muslim lawyer, opposed to me, a brown Muslim lawyer who is politically active on various fronts with Cage and what have you. It might be better for your defense, it might be better for your case. And I'm glad they talked me out of it and we carried on representing them. But this is the kind of climate we live in where I have to try to protect my client's best interests, which at times I feel would be better off if I don't represent them, not because of the quality of my representation, but because of the inherent prejudice within the system, whereas they would look at the representative, this Muslim lawyer with a beard who espouses political views quite regularly in the media and on social media. Is that going to jeopardize my client? And I feel that it does. I'll be honest. One of the things I mentioned in the book is about how in one case of a client who was facing deportation following a terrorism conviction, that while I was representing him in those proceedings, separately he had family proceedings ongoing with respect to the care of his children. And his family lawyer contacted me. Not his family lawyer, the mother of the children, her family lawyer contacted me off the record and said, look, your name has come up in the paperwork. And I couldn't understand why my name would have featured, apart from saying that I'm his immigration lawyer. But it featured and she said, you need to sort it out because and this is her word, she goes, I recognize this line of attack and they are going for you and they're building up that case. So what had happened was my client's wife had contacted me and asked me to represent her in these Children Act proceedings. I wrote back to her and said, look, I'm conflicted, first of all. And secondly, I'm not a family law practitioner. What I can do is I'll write to the local authority and I will ask them for additional time until you find a suitable representative. And that's all I did. I then I was going on holiday for a few weeks. So I went on holiday. When I came back, a relative was seriously ill. So I was not working properly for a week or two. And then I replied to the local authority after that. Quite innocuous as far as I'm concerned. But the way that was seen by the local authority and their lawyers, most disturbingly by their legal team, was that was used to say that I had engaged in al-Muhajirun type delaying tactics. So just get that, al-Muhajirun, a proscribed terrorist organization, that I, an officer of the court, had engaged in tactics employed by that group to try to disrupt their intervention with the children. Moreover, it was one of the reasons, and I saw this in black and white, one of the reasons provided by the local authority for intervening and saying that her children were at risk of extremism because of her extreme ideology was that she approached me to represent her, knowing that I'm not a family law practitioner, but I have, and then they had extracts of my events for CAGE and for HUGS, which is a registered charity which looks after the families of those convicted of terrorism. But my platforms where I've spoken, those were contained in this document, this dossier against me. And that was used to try to remove a woman's children from her. I mean, just try to let that sink in, because there's something so innocuous was used. So therefore, when I tell people I'm afraid to represent my clients, I don't want me to be the cause of their further suffering at the hands of the state. So that's kind of where I am with this issue. And so writing the book and writing the chapter, not only was it therapeutic for myself, but then reading everybody else's contributions and realizing, look, it's not just me in my professional sphere. This is affecting so many other people. It's, you know, I thank Austin for giving everyone that space to actually, I guess, get off their chest what's been bothering them so long. I mean, a lot of the time you become so used to it, it becomes normality. There was a thread recently, someone talked about their stops at airports, and something, it triggered a memory in myself from, again, about 12, 13 years ago when I was traveling via Milan and Malpensa airport, and I was suddenly stopped and had my passport checked randomly. But while my passport was being checked, I had the armed police officer raise his gun at me and make me raise my hands while they did their checks. And this lasted, this was at a time of high security around Europe. Nevertheless, I was stuck, and then I had another 4 hours in that airport with those people looking at me and wondering why they took such an interest in me. But I blocked that out as, this is normal traveling while Muslim, this is normal experiences. It's not, we should be used to it, and we should factor in that into our travels. Similarly, when it comes to practicing as a Muslim lawyer who represents terror suspects, I accept this as part of the territory, that if I'm going to do this job, I will come under suspicion. I will have to face further, difficulties in representing my clients that other lawyers may not have to. I will at times have to employ white counsel, white barristers, white experts to protect, as I said, to cover myself, literally, because you sit behind counsel. So it is my cover from the judge. And I can take a moral ground and say, I'm not going to do it. But as an officer of the court and representing my client's best interests, it's something that, strategically I have to do to get the best outcome for my client. It's not a fair system, but no one says it is. We know it's an unfair system. We know it's unjust. But my job is to protect my client. Taking a challenge to the system is not something that my client wants to do. He wants to get out. He wants to be with his family. So for me to make a moral point to protect him is not my decision, really. I can't do it in that atmosphere. What is interesting is a lot of my cases revolve around ideology and whether my clients possess an extremist ideology. So very often I have to propagate that the opinions they hold on, I won't even use the word controversial, on mainstream opinions on issues like jihad, like Sharia law, like a caliphate, that these are mainstream beliefs held by a cross-section of the Muslim community, and there's no inherent link with having those beliefs and violent acts of terrorism. So when I have to explain this in court, in submissions, it's from a judge's perspective, when he sees or he receives submissions from Fahad Ansari as opposed to John Doe, it's very different. And you can see the reaction, you can see the facial expressions, you can see the suspicion on their face as to whether it is the defendant speaking or his representative. And that is a sign of the systematic prejudice within the system that cannot be resolved through individual cases, but on a wider perspective within the legal community, they need to take up that challenge. All members of the legal community need to take up that challenge to defeat this head on. I think I've spoken quite at length and rambled on for too long, so I'll stop there. I'm sure people can ask me more questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Fahad. We will have time in a moment for people to put questions. I believe we're going till 5:15. That I think is the typical time for JOMEC's seminar series. So before we open the floor to general conversation, we did ask a scholar from each of the two centers supporting this event to have some sort of prepared comments in advance. And I'm just going to ask Kerry Moore to just speak for a little bit about her reflections on the book as a whole, and then I'll take a couple of minutes to do the same before we then open the floor.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thank you to Michael, Abdullah Razim and the Islam UK Centre for the invitation to join this panel, and of course, as ever, to my JOMEC colleagues, Katrina, Maria and Julie for organising the session too. I'm honoured to be a part of this event and to have the opportunity to discuss this remarkable book. I'd firstly like to extend my congratulations to Asim and to Shanaz and to Farhad and to all of the other authors on the publication of the book. It's truly a compelling and an enriching read, and if you haven't yet had an opportunity to lay your hands on a copy, I'd wholeheartedly recommend it to everyone. Before I talk about what I think are some of the really striking aspects of the book, I would like very briefly to frame this response and my position as a discussant by explaining how my research has led me to being on this panel. I'm not, after all, a Muslim. Indeed, in I Refuse to Condemn, Sadia Habib begins her chapter, The Racialized Go-To Muslim, with the words, "Dear left-wing white liberal friend." And yes, I was very conscious whilst reading this that I, white woman of JOMEC, very likely fit the bill for this address. Habib's advice is, and I quote, to reflect upon and rethink your position and your privilege before you approach those who are racialized with stereotypes, assumptions and demands. And for us to move beyond what she calls the white mirror. So quite some time ago now, back in 2008, myself and JOMEC colleagues Justin Lewis and Paul Mason wrote a research report commissioned by Channel 4's Dispatches programme, looking at the representation of Islam in the press. It was a time when Abu Hamza was a staple of tabloid front pages, and the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, was according to the tabloids, provoking public outcry by talking about Sharia law. The findings of that research came as no surprise to most of the British Muslims who got in touch with us after the programme. It was obvious that there was stigmatising language in the news, that a harmful image of Islam was prevalent, and that the religious and cultural practices of Muslims in Britain were increasingly cast as incompatible with mainstream British culture and values. And whilst people told us that our research was important, I don't think that I quite understood, and perhaps not until reading this book, why it also felt like there was so much more going on with their responses. How we were calling attention to a dominant public image of Islam, which had been so outrageously caging Muslims, to borrow a term that's used frequently in I Refuse to Condemn, repressing freedoms and personal safety, religious and cultural expression in everyday lives and community, and which also repressed the political, cutting off avenues for resistance within a simplistic moral worldview of good and bad people, us and outsiders, entrapping Muslims over and again with a no-win war on terror rhetoric. Our findings mainly surprised white, non-Muslim liberal audiences who, however sincerely, may well have performatively benefited from expressing white liberal anger at the injustices they were now hearing about. However, as I Refuse to Condemn clearly demonstrates, the same kind of performative benefit is not on the cards for Muslim critical voices. Indeed, the book challenges the very idea that Muslims can freely express critical points of view publicly, particularly on mainstream media platforms. Across multiple contexts and issues, the contributors to this book vividly depict this injustice when it comes to having a public voice, from state racism and Islamophobia to violent crime, to music and even fashion. Many of the authors describe it as a game in which passing a test to prove that you're a good Muslim is a precondition of the opportunity to be heard. It's a double-edged sword where playing the part, as Hoda Katabi puts it in her chapter, is, she says, always only ever a rigged game played out on a white supremacist game board. This isn't just about representation in the present, but a neutralizing strategy, as we hear from Yassir Morsi in his chapter. When we play the game of talking and condemning terrorism, he says, we lose our future move. So it's fair to say that this book took me on a journey from assuming an understanding of the politics of Islamophobia that I did not really have. I absolutely jumped too quickly to try to think strategically and pragmatically, and in my mind, helpfully, about whether refusing to condemn terrible violent acts, for example, might sometimes and probably usually be necessary for Muslims in the public eye to avoid becoming an easy target and to avoid a too easy reproduction of further racialized harms. Very quickly, as I read the book, this position started to unravel. Shanaz's public attitude research in the opening chapter convincingly shows us that such condemning may not actually transform hostile attitudes towards Muslims very significantly at all. Yet I worried that not condemning might still just make things even worse. Of course, this is outrageously unjust. Why should anyone be burdened with such a responsibility to condemn the acts or the ideas of other individuals, to try to manage public attitudes? A responsibility constructed to control, to classify, and to produce knowledge about Muslims in the service of dominant white non-Muslim interests, a burden that produces and reproduces Islamophobia in its very premise. Throughout parts 1 and 2 of the book, historical and contemporary histories of state violence, mediated Islamophobia, and institutionalized injustice are layered in the accounts of the authors, compellingly woven through their personal narratives and professional experiences. Fatima Regina's account of racism within the British education system, for example, of the history of anti-racist struggle within the Bangladeshi community of the East End, and of state violence revolves around questions of belonging. Regina's narrative leads us to one of the most high-profile and controversial cases, the revocation of Shamima Begum's citizenship. It's not a case that the chapter explores in depth, but through it, Regina reminds the reader how state violence justifies itself to the wider majority white and non-Muslim public all too easily through such extraordinary examples, feeding on the alienation and humiliation of an over-surveilled people. Regina calls for resistance by building solidarity across difference, and through that solidarity, she sees the creation of hope. And in part 2 of the book, the chapters paint a detailed picture of how the formidable power of the state and its anti-terrorism apparatus has long institutionalized racism, dehumanizing cultures of suspicion, not least through policies such as PREVENT, and embedded injustice within technologies of surveillance and control. And the authors make it clear that resistance within such oppressive systems is exhausting and opportunities are few. Repeatedly throughout the book, feeling caged and feeling exhausted are words we hear from people doing remarkable work to resist these structures in their fields. In Shaf Chowdhury's account of racialized harms that are encoded within airport security algorithms, this navigates the reader through the intellectual and emotional labor that's involved in recognizing that I'm the glitch in the system, as he puts it, and therefore routinely subject to intrusive checks, a labor that racialized privilege generally allows others routinely to avoid. In part 3 of the book, the section where I recognized myself as a left-wing white liberal friend, my newfound comfort with refusing to condemn was challenged once again. Cyrus McGoldrick's chapter, perhaps more combatively than others, draws attention, quite rightly of course, to the immense violence inflicted upon countries designated as the enemy and the violence that this has inevitably bred. I'm definitely not qualified to engage with any argument on a theological level, but I admit I did feel uncomfortable with the notion that humans have no place in condemning violence at all. Is that really what the world needs? But then, to the final part of the book, part 4, Resisting the Performance, from Loki's account of a border stop on the way to the Calais jungle to Mansour Khan's Love Us poem, what is powerfully conveyed is the relentless squeeze on viable spaces for resistance. I've already mentioned Hoda Katabi, the US fashion blogger and activist. Her experience of a hostile media interview meant to be about fashion has really stayed with me. The absurdity of tokenizing spaces in the mainstream media, of being told you do not sound American for voicing a perfectly legitimate political perspective. She says it's vital that we as Muslims do not compromise our identities or lend them to violent institutions to justify the oppression of our own or other communities. So in summary, the immense value of reading this book, from my position at least, is that it provides an opportunity to learn, bringing to life the politics of structural racism and racialized privilege. And I want sincerely to thank Asim and the authors for this opportunity to see anew the struggle against Islamophobia and to learn more about what anti-racism really means. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerry, for those comments. Really great. Very fortunate to have people who are invested in and coming at it from different perspectives. And you get a sense, I'm sure, if you haven't encountered the book already, of just the variety that's within there, which also then speaks the variety of voices that we bring to encountering all these different narratives. I will speak a little bit, but I want to make sure there's room for others to talk, and we were a little bit delayed getting through the digital door initially, so I will keep it brief. But fortunately, things that I wanted to mention have been talked about by others, so I don't need to dwell too much on that. What I really want to highlight, aside from the tour through the book that we received, is just that blending of the personal and the professional, and seeing how the impacts of this expectation to condemn they work at both levels. And Asim in his introduction, and as he spoke about at the beginning of this event, just you get a real clear sense of the hurt at the personal level that is experienced, as well as the difficulties at the professional level, which speaks to things that both Asim and Fahad talk about, that doing your work is complicated by this. And what I wanted to focus on, what I talk a lot with my students about in terms of the representation of Muslims in the media, is about this idea of a double standard and the doubleness that goes on. And maybe this is even something that, with Kerry's comments, looking at how easy it is for some of us to say, it's terrible how that happens, and know that that is, if I choose to speak about my condemning of an act of violence, that's something that is not going to be demanded of me as an individual, that I can freely offer that perspective, and that others aren't so free. So the exceptional quality that is placed on some, not all, of the citizens, the residents, the people who are engaged in these discussions. And that's when I was putting the tweet together just to get ready for this event, and I think about uneven expectations is a phrase I come to. So some of the definitions that stood out for me in this, I want to quote a bit from Yasser Morsi's chapter, The Impossible Muslim, that he brings up. And he says, condemnation is built on a double bind with two false paths. We lose in both directions. And that's, I think, just so clear to when you walk through this book and see where it comes out, that he says, in the first instance, our hypothetical exit from the shadow of the Muslim, and that's in quotation, does not liberate us, for it is not our shadow. Instead, condemnation is that very act that marks us as strangers. And when we condemn, we unwittingly accept the shadow is ours, and around racism goes. To condemn is to accept we are rightfully under trial for our otherness. to accept the status of a suspended sentence, to accept it's bin Laden behind our shoulder, to accept them as observer and we as observed. So in that first side of this double bind that you're placed into, it's that to do that is to accept the narrative that says there's automatically something wrong or suspicious about you by dint of your religious identification. And then he goes on in the course of the second instance, if we do not condemn, we will self-verify our status as undecidable, as questionable, as not willing to be nice, an other who hides. And I think that his writing is really effective in this chapter. It's sort of giving language around that. He says deeper into the chapter, I cannot speak to the West without making visible the politics which render my speech that of a Muslim. So there's this sense that to be a Muslim in society, or to be perceived as a Muslim, because the definition, as we know, is not necessarily one that you identify yourself, but is often one that is externally imposed upon you, that to do so carries with it a burden of associations that not everyone carries. And so that the liberty that certain members of our society are not at when they speak or don't speak on this is made quite apparent in this. And I saw this echoed as well in this section from Suhaima Mansour Khan. She's a poet, and speaking about public engagement, she says, the more I tried to prove how funny, non-violent, good-natured I was, the more I was accepting the logic that my humanity is conditional upon such evidence. That struck me because obviously, you know, in the individual setting, much as the respondents in the policy documents that Shanaz was working with would feel that if you can start out by communicating your message that you're okay and you're safe and you're acceptable, it will go better for you in whatever social engagement you are in. And so we would be recognizing why someone would choose to do that, to make getting on easier. And yet this book repeatedly pushes us to think about the wider implications of doing that for yourself, for your fellows, and indeed for all, because as Shaz reminded us just today, that the lens needs to turn back on those asking the question, why is it that I'm making this demand? And behind it is that assertion, and we talk about phrases that resounded through the book. Ones for me were this demonstration of my humanity, that it should be an assumption already that I condemn violence, that I condemn killing, because we're all given life, and life is precious. Why would we assume that that wasn't precious to any of us? And so the expectation that you speak that forth is self-exceptional and unevenly applied. I think I'm going to hold my comments there, except just to point out briefly the question of agency, and this is one that again comes through, that as much as it's a double bind, it's that you don't necessarily have freedom over when you are put in situations where you are given the opportunity to condemn or to not condemn, because this is part of a wide lens of narrative spoken about you as well as to you. And it's not a surprise that Shanaz really wanted to bring the mediated aspect into this and have us work with JOMEC, our partners at the university, on this, because that is the venue in which these discussions happen, both as in Asim's case in a direct confrontation live on air, on television, or in the things that we read and consume as audiences, where these messages once again are thrust back at us. So I want to thank you for joining us and sharing these, and I want to thank you for your work in the book already.